Welcome back to Political Excess. I don't often go into cultural stories, but every once in a while I think it's good to see where things are at, and a lot of times it does overlap with politics. So today I wanted to cover this story. Some of you may have already heard about it, but it's Stanford University's Guide to Elimination of Harmful Language. So I will scroll through this and provide a little bit of commentary. Now, there's been a lot of stories in recent years where some elite university, or sometimes a corporation, they release guidelines on the new thing that is suddenly offensive, or guidelines on how to change yourself, how to change your language behavior so you don't offend people. A lot of people would refer to this as being woke. That's kind of the colloquial way this has come to be described. You can put it other ways: excessive social justice, identity politics, speech control, etc. Now, I'm not going to go over all the individual examples. There's a lot on here. A lot of them are completely outlandish. And I know a lot of people aren't a fan of this, but I'm definitely not at all a fan of creating these lists of words that are supposed to be unacceptable to say anymore. Now, this isn't 100% of the time. Sometimes over the years or even decades, certain words have become harder hitting, but a list like this goes way, way beyond something like that. This is an expansive list across a lot of different categories, and the categories listed here are disability, ethnic, gender, implicit, and sexual biases. And it talks a little bit about the background, about how they came up with the list, but I really think this does speak to that elite liberal culture. Now, at a glance, a lot of these words or phrases I haven't even heard in a long time. Some of them I hear very rarely, so I don't think they're much of an issue. Some of the other ones I do hear a little bit more frequently. I don't think the vast majority of people are going to stop saying them, at least in private. I think they're going to be overburdened to try to control their own speech when they're in public, and I think that's a problem. Another thing is, I think a lot of people were not even aware that the vast majority of these were supposed to be offensive. Because when you really start looking through these, you got to go, what is the line here? Some of these are vague connections to things in the distant past that were maybe a little bit offensive, but nobody would be aware of that today, so for that reason, we can't say it anymore. And I understand I don't have to personally be offended by them to realize other people might be offended, but that is the question. Are the people really offended by them? Or are the elites of these groups supposed to be representing them and just saying they're offensive? Because I think a lot of people know when you're on the street, when you're in private, people are not going to polish their speech to this extent, not even close. There's so many situations where this stuff, or much, much worse, genuine slurs and obscenity, those are prevalent. Usually in online gaming, there's a ton of it. So then you go through this list, and there's so many things that seem genuinely innocuous that it's very difficult to try to adjust your whole line of thinking and speech pattern. And then you don't even know if the next day or the next month, the next year, if there's a new batch of words you've got to get used to, and maybe even change some of the ones you already just learned. There's really a lot of volatility in this kind of thing. And I understand they're not saying you should be arrested or penalized, but at the same time, they kind of want some kind of punishment behind it. Sure, if you publicly came out and said you're against this, I think there would be blowback, because then you would appear to be one of those people that's kind of against the broader underlying movement, and that is intolerable. And apparently there's not allowed to be any pushback for that kind of movement. Whatever they say goes, because if you do question it, there's bound to be all kinds of smears and labeling, and people are not going to want to associate with you anymore. And that's a real problem if there's that kind of tacit societal pressure to conform to one point of view. So there's a lot you could point out here that's completely ludicrous. The one I do want to point out here is they actually have Karen on here. It's kind of a neologism. It's a new term people started saying over the last few years. I don't really say it myself. I'm not horribly offended if people do say it. I just never thought it was a good description whatsoever. But Stanford here recommends changing it to demanding or entitled white woman. Their explanation is this term is used to ridicule or demean a certain group of people based on their behaviors. This is completely mind-blowing because they literally want you to change it to a full sentence that attacks and generalizes an entire race of people. Saying demanding or entitled white woman? How could that possibly not be highly offensive? If this list absolutely scours the entire dictionary and history of the English language to find the slightest negative connotation, you'd think their new description would not openly deride an entire race of people. But then again, that's where this woke kind of stuff completely falls off the rails. Apparently, it's all about historical group power dynamics. They do not care about offending men or white people. as this entry here, I think, objectively indicates. Because what if people are offended by that? Or what if they're offended by any of these other word changes? Now we have a new group of offended people. How do they deal with it? This really never ends. At some point they have to say, we care about this person or this group more than this other person, and they're going to create a hierarchy of victimhood. And that's the problem. I think a lot of people see it in society because there's a lot of other words that you could say are offensive on here. The word racist, that should be out of here. That has been so overly used. And I think it does soften the meaning of real racists and racism out there. The word equity could be considered offensive, as that would mean taking from one group of people based on their identity and giving it to another group of people. The word diversity could be considered offensive, as that generally only applies to when there's too many white people or too many men. Marginalized could be offensive, because that negatively reinforces stereotypes. Inclusion, that should be offensive, because that inevitably will result in excluding other people. This just goes on and on and on. I think this is far more pernicious than it looks. This is not just somebody in their spare time making a list for the Onion. This isn't some old George Carlin routine where he goes through language in a humorous way. These are elite institutions doing this. It happens in corporate America, and it trickles down from there. And it's all viewed as the right thing to do. And I think the underlying feeling is you feel guilty if you don't do it. This will prove that you're battling power differentials and you're not racist. If you commit to all of this stuff, there's no limits. If you commit to it, you'll feel like a little bit better of a person. And the fact that there is not a lot of societal pushback on this, at least in a meaningful way, that's a major problem. I think the general public does scoff at this. They kind of laugh it off a little bit. But the fact that this is pushed by people with real power in society, and sometimes it's trickled into the military, it's trickled into government, then there's really a concern about this kind of ideology spreading, and then being backed up with either state or other significant forms of power. Now, the reason this ties into politics is because, as you may have heard me say on this channel before, this is the problem with people who would be considered on the left, or the Democrats, the liberal establishment, however you'd like to put it. Sometimes Republicans, they get in on this stuff too. It makes them feel good as well. But this is extremely disconnected from what people actually think about, what working class people are going to want to put on their list of priorities. This has nothing to do with any of that. And this is the kind of thing that I think is driving people away from the Democrats. It's largely this kind of cultural stuff. And I think if there was more attention on it, it would drive even more people away. Because if they really believed in this stuff and it was really the right thing to do, I think it would get a lot more attention. But I think whenever it does, people recoil at it. And I can't understand why people would say, you know what, I do support Democrats in some economic issues, but if they can't stand up to this kind of stuff at all, they're going to vote for the Republican. To me, I can understand that. And you could say this only applies to Stanford. No need to think about this if you're just working at a factory. It's not exclusive to just Stanford. It's all over the place. This and other forms of it, there's an entire industry based on this kind of thing, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what a lot of people, again, would call wokeness. Occasionally it gets a little bit of attention in the media. A lot of times it doesn't. This is definitely not a topic they want to be covering. It's going to stoke the flames of exposing their side as being too extreme. And I think this is all a major problem for society. This really has got to be addressed. It's creating all kinds of new tension and discrimination, making people hyper-aware of the differences between us. I think it has the opposite intention as it's supposed to. And I think there's a lot of elite people at the top of this kind of ideology, and I think a lot of those people are making a lot of money off of this. And even though a lot of this would be associated with the left is much better, much more crowd-pleasing when they talk about populist economics. That's where they will do much better than the right, much better than Republicans. And this kind of thinking, this is indicative of the exact wrong way to go about connecting with the working class, or even the non-working class for that matter. The more attention this gets, the more I think people don't like it. But there's yet to be a critical mass yet to push back on this kind of thing. We don't need a new list of words or phrases that we shouldn't say, especially when there's rife with hypocrisy. We just need to treat people decently. Certain things are obviously offensive we can avoid. There's a lot of slurs that we understand. Those aren't on this list. And there's a lot of profanity. That's not on this list either. I think a lot of people might be offended by that as well. So everybody has their own list of things they're offended by. You can't apply that to everybody else. Just don't be a jerk when you're in public. And also, don't be looking for ways to be offended. Anyway, I could go on about this for a long time. I don't want to go on too long of a rant about it, but this is just what I think about this. What do you think about this list, and what do you think about this broader topic? Are you fine with there being a lot of new things that are suddenly offensive and we should change? Or do you think this has gone a little bit too far? Or do you think this has gone extremely too far? And how do you think the politics factor into this kind of thing? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy this channel and enjoy these kinds of commentaries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.